Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and this is going to be the second of my improvised quickie articles, and hopefully there will come a day when I actually do transcribe a lot of these and sort of want to make them articles in their own right. And also, this one might be a little bit more confusing at first sight, but there is plenty to say about it. This is Chris and time. Now, you might be wondering what time has in relation for Chris. Well, from a more morbid point of view, you're going to sort of see for yourself. Because one thing that's kind of fascinated me a little bit when learning about Chris is the idea that every day is like a little adventure for him. He will wake up probably at either 10 o'clock or 12 o'clock or at some point during the afternoon. He will play video games, complains that his house is a mess and that he needs a boyfriend-free girl. He will then play some more video games. He may occasionally, if he has the leisure for it, try to write something for Sonichu, go out and eat at McDonald's or Burger King, play more video games in the evening, and then get to bed roughly about 2 o'clock just to do the whole cycle over again. Now, it may be viewed, ladies and gentlemen, that's a little bit more of a stereotypical generalization towards Chris's day, but it does cover a fairly innocuous but also a fairly morbid truth when it comes to Chris's life, is that, like with other things, when it comes like love or friendship or kinship or the attention that he gets from the internet, time is something that Chris takes for granted. For example, in more recent times, Chris's maladaptive coping mechanisms, believing he's Jesus Christ Sonichu, believing he has magical powers, believing all the things that happen in the comics actually happen in reality, whether you want to say this is in relation to the idea guys, or whether or not this was just something that was lying under Chris's thin-skinned surface and was going to emerge and manifest one way or another. There's speculation on stuff like that all the time. But what I'm trying to suggest, ladies and gentlemen, is the fact that Chris is, at the recording of this video, is 42 years old. Chris is nowhere near the young man or woman that Chris thinks he is anymore. What I'm trying to say in this context is the fact that whether Chris realizes or not is that time is something that ultimately runs out for people. Nobody stays on top forever. And whether Chris wants to acknowledge it or not, well, time is going to run out for Chris, whether Chris likes it or not. What's slightly concerning a little bit about this article is that you may be thinking to yourself is that if Chris reflected or reminisced on his life, as he's often want to do in more recent times, would Chris be proud or satisfied of the fact that the life Chris has laid has come back and ultimately not been the best example for the world to follow? But at the same time, let's think about this in relative speaking, is that Chris, through years of not having to go to work, has had money given to him by the government, by the US taxpayer. Chris still, probably at this time, still is surrounded by toys and has slightly better accommodation worked out for Chris, despite the fact that all that Chris had to do was absolutely nothing for it outside of what happened in 2021, and that Chris has enjoyed a lifetime of fast food, of, basically living almost like a king surrounded in his own squalor. But ultimately, it didn't really seem to be of something that really fazed Chris in any way whatsoever. Because you got the odd Ween or White Knight who would buy something from Chris to make sure that Chris was doing okay. You had people donating hundreds of dollars a month to Chris's Patreon, despite the fact that Chris did not seem to update his Patreon for years, and people still gave him money all the same. Chris earned more than most people who are on minimum wage did, and Chris didn't work for over 20 years, let alone apply for a job for 15 years. But that's all just things that have happened in the past. The fact that Chris has had it relatively easy, despite the fact that Chris has made every single attempt to not make life easy for himself. But what about the future? What does the future hold for Chris? You know, will Chris just get tired of what he does and just drop the facade of being called Jesus Christ Chan Sonichu? Or will Chris just fly off the handle once again? People will be morbidly interested in the things that Chris does. They might occasionally buy something or donate an art piece to a contest for Chris to judge. And considering I've covered a lot of Chris's contest entries beforehand, you gotta wonder exactly what sort of people are out there that are willing to actually give Chris some of their time, let alone their own artwork, done absolutely for nothing, just for Chris to judge and, well, peer his eyes over. One might argue that due to Chris's ill health from a lifetime of eating McDonald's and Burger King, that these things are going to ultimately come back and bite Chris very sharply on the arse. I mean, 42 years old, and Chris is still very much with us. He's still very much alive, and, well, in less than, 8 years' time, Chris will be in his 50s. And I don't know why, but for whatever reason, I don't really think we'll be having the same conversations about Chris, because Chris is still a locale now as he has ever been, but he'll be turning 50 in less than in 8 years, and you gotta wonder where on earth Chris is going to be in that time. Will anybody know? Will anybody care? Will people fade interest, or will Chris just crawl and crawl and crawl until eventually he can't crawl any longer? It's a very curious situation, because, well, who knows what the future holds, but is it more important at this stage, ladies and gentlemen, to be more concerned about our future, about what's going to happen to us, about where we've come from and where we are going? Chris doesn't really seem to have much true concern about where he's going, because, well, you may argue this is a point of view on just people who have no future and no hopes of securing any sort of future whatsoever, especially in regards to Chris, is that people like Chris sometimes view the day as just a thing to get through, and they can't really think any further ahead than tomorrow. But that's sort of where this whole article comes to an end, is a gentle reminder that even though Chris could have been argued as being completely screwed his own life over, despite the fact that he had every opportunity in the book to try and redeem himself and try to make the better use of his short time on this earth, he chose not to. Okay, so sorry about that. But like I said again, is that, well, at the end of the day, only we are completely capable of being masters of our own destiny. And whether or not Chris had the initiative or the foresight to say earlier on that maybe I need to seriously think about what I'm doing, but maybe Chris never had this thought, because the idea that Chris was completely comfortable in his situation was more than enough to satisfy his needs, and therefore that's ultimately all that mattered. So, a sad but not a fairly uncommon tale, unfortunately. But with all that being said and done, I hope you guys have enjoyed this improvised article, and I cannot wait to see all of you guys again in the next video. Take care, and bye-bye for now.